Good morning, everyone. We wanted to first start off by thanking you for being with us this morning. We recognize that there were tons of breakout sessions that you could have been at, and you chose ours. So we're going to do our best to give you lots of information and lots of takeaways that you can turn around and use right away in your schools. So just very briefly, my name's Kristen Gallahan. I work for the Chester County Intermediate Unit. For the purposes of this presentation, I was the principal that was on board at the time. I've since moved to a different position, but all the things that we've implemented here, I was the principal for that. With me is Matt Harris, who is the vice principal for the Learning Center, and Lindsay Erdy, who is our consultant for Devereaux Center for Effective Schools. So bear with me for a brief moment. We have a couple of people with us from our core team. Do you guys mind standing up so we can thank you? Like, seriously, raise your hand then. Right in the front, they all, perhaps our consultants from Devereaux will be, can you guys stand up because you've helped us through this whole process? Thank you. So just really quickly, you guys have in front of you a reflection sheet, and it does have our goals and our targets for the presentation this morning. And hopefully you'll be able to check all those boxes that we've met all of our expectations. We are not claiming to be experts by any stretch of the imagination. This is not going to be entirely new material. You may hear things that you've heard before, but what we're attempting to share with you today is things that impacted us, and we're hoping to package it in a framework that makes sense for you that you can turn around and use. So you will see on our agenda, as Kristen mentioned, you get lunch after this. So just eyes on the prize. We'll get through it, and like any good lesson plan, we do have our lesson agenda posted, trying to remind you of your time frame. The times are a little bit off. We've made a couple of changes, but we've tried to pack our presentation full of really best practices in terms of PBIS, but we're not going to have time to review all of them. We're happy to share with you anything that we have. We have our expectations for our special events, because this would be a special event like an assembly that you would have in the school, and so they're posted around the room as well. So we are the Learning Center Panthers, which is why everything is black and yellow. So thank you to those of you that wore our school colors. You were prepared ahead of time, and you did earn Panther Bucks. So we will be raffling off our centerpieces based on people that earned Panther Bucks this morning. So we encourage you to pay attention and be with us. So the agenda, we're going to briefly give you a background, and we'll talk about the three components of professional learning that have helped us move through the year. So just briefly, our programs. So we are a center-based program. We're the Chester County Intermediate Unit. We have 3 programs. In the Career Academy, we have about 110 students. Those are students that have a half a day of a pre-vocational shop and a half a day of academics. In our options program, we have students that have significant emotional or behavioral need, and I forgot to mention that we are purely secondary, all ages 7th through 12th grade. And those students have access to a wide behavior team, mental health services, but all of our students that attend our school have special needs. And then our transitions program is the only program that houses students that do not have special needs, but most of them are thought to be, so we have about 10 students in that program. That most of the time go through evaluation after they come to us. So we're trying to build your lens so that you recognize how we approached our PBIS model. So our students come from all over the place. At this point, we're servicing 29 districts. We also have a large portion of our students that come from a local residential treatment facility. We've seen an increase this year in students that attend or are residing in local group homes. So those are students that don't have a ton of support, and they just bring, we're trying to make sure that you understand like the type of student that we have. So they bring a whole different aspect. So the challenges that we had in terms of why we approached our professional development the way that we did is we have a high population that the student turnover is really high. Our students that are living at the local residential treatment facility, they may be with us one day and get discharged the next. Our staff turnover is obviously very high, so while we're doing things to try and combat that, staff gets burnt out when they're working with really difficult students. Additionally, we had a challenge in meeting consistency across programs. So our building came into existence 5 years ago. Career Academy was housed in one building, Options was housed in another building, and so we took students that had that were mostly learning support, autistic support with students that had really significant emotional needs, and we combined them into one building so that we had a secondary continuum to offer to all of our districts. What happened was that we had two really distinct programs that both operated really well on their own, but then when we were in a building together, we had really difficult time being consistent. And obviously communication between staff, when you have a lot of support staff in the building, you have people that might be responding and not necessarily have time to get back to the classroom staff. So we had difficulty also with our communication. And I'm going to apologize. I talk really, really fast. So if you have any questions, just jot them down on your reflection sheet, and I promise we will get to them at the end. So just to give you a little bit of a background on our initiatives and our timeline, the building came together in 2014 is when the building was established. We started working with the Center for Effective Schools in 2016 and 2017. They came in and did audits, observations, interviews, and ultimately came back with a suggestion that we would implement PBIS. In 2017, 2018 is when we started our Tier 1 implementation. We did our BOQ in the spring of 2018. We started working on the development of Tier 2 at the beginning of this school year, and then we will be recognized at lunch. And I am not above asking for a little additional praise. If you guys want to clap really loudly when my team stands up, that's awesome. Yeah, so it's good. So this is Lindsay.
So many things. Oh,
Sorry.
okay, so I don't know how to balance a microphone and a clicker, but I'll do my best. So you all know, you're all here for school-wide PBIS, so a lot of this stuff is not new to you, but really our core components here are prevention, multi-tiered supports, and database decision-making. What we're really focusing on today is that prevention piece. So how are we employing effective systems to support our staff while they support our students, right? So we want to make sure that our staff are using evidence-based practices to support student behavior. Particularly, we'll talk about classroom management within the Learning Center. And as we're looking at those preventative practices, we're still always looking at our data. So one, to what extent are staff implementing these practices? Two, what impact is that having on our students? And three, what changes do we need to make to be even better? Gosh, this is quite the balance. I'm good, I think. So effective classroom management is a critical component of reducing disruptive behavior in PBIS. And effective classroom management fits in at that Tier 1 level of support. So we're talking about classroom management practices being supportive for all students. So this is a universal thing. And what we know is that staff need more than just your typical school-wide practices to actually bring PBIS into the classroom. And so we know that teachers who have low perceptions of their ability to manage the classroom, they have increased burnout, they have more emotional exhaustion, and they have a lower perception of their own personal accomplishment. And we know all of those things, as we see at the Learning Center, they lead to staff leaving the classroom, leaving the profession. And so we want to really support those staff in what they do. Typically, too, our school-wide PBIS full-day trainings, we don't really talk about classroom management. So what we're doing at the Learning Center is really trying to address those things through our PD. So there's obviously a lot of issues in the classroom that teachers need to manage, and we really want to focus on supporting them in their evidence-based practices. First, a little bit about students with emotional and behavioral disorders. So out of all students across the country that are identified with disabilities, about 8% of students are diagnosed with EBD, and that equates to over 400,000 students across the country. We know that males outnumber females, these students are disproportionately African American, and that less than 50% of students actually are getting supports early on. So we are seeing the majority of the students that need these supports in the middle school and high school grades. We also know that even though we're talking about an alternative placement today, that most of these students are now receiving their supports in general education settings. And while we know that, we also know that a lot of teachers are not getting the training they need in their pre-service programs to support these students. So a lot of teachers don't get formal training in research-based classroom management practices, and actually few teacher training programs have a dedicated course to classroom management practices. When universities do have courses like this, they're often focused on reactive or punishment procedures, and so a lot of times teachers get into their school settings and they have to really rely on the in-service training that we give them. These are just a few strategies that are evidence-based that teachers of students with EBD can use in their classrooms, and we'll get into this more later when we talk about coaching. And so just a quote I want to leave you with that we'll circle back to: staff training is frequently necessary for assisting human services personnel in performing their work duties. So staff training is necessary and staff training is good, but alone it's rarely sufficient in producing the outcomes that we'd like to see. So staff training is good, and we'll talk about all the great things the Learning Center is doing, but often we need to follow that up with something to really see teachers implement the practices and to see the benefits for students. So back to you.
Great, thank you. Had to shed a layer. I'm going to move around a little bit. So really quickly, like Lindsay was saying, do you have the clicker? It's all right. Professional learning, professional development, professional growth opportunities. We call it all kinds of different things. So what we want you to take a second on your reflection sheet, and this is a lotus flower for those of you that don't know, and the reason that I use it is because I'm obsessed with them right now, and they grow in soil in the muddiest parts of water, and then they have to grow in mud in order to grow and become beautiful. So it took us some time to get where we are. So I just want you to reflect on the lotus flower a little bit. So take a minute in the little box next to your reflection, list just words, just jot some words that you think are relate to professional learning. What do you need for really effective professional learning? Just make a quick list. Can you hand out some Panther Bucks? What? Mr. Harris is handing out some Panther Bucks. Don't forget your behavior-specific praise. Thank you for working. Okay, and finish your last thought, write your last word. I'm going to read a list. For those of you that aren't familiar, Learning Forward has a ton of resources for you. These are their professional learning standards. So if you've written any of these words down, give yourself a circle. Things like data, community, continuous, leaders, developing capacity, create support systems, plan, assess, evaluate, theories, research, aligning outcomes with educational performance. Those are all things that we look for when we talk about professional learning opportunities for staff. So just as a quick reminder of the challenges that we faced and why we went with the model that we did, is we had high student turnover, high staff turnover. We were trying to create consistency across programs and increase communication between staff. So the three cogs of the wheel that we use for our own professional learning is we have new employee training. Previously, when staff came to us, I don't know how it works in your districts, but our staff got a day of training at the mothership or the district office, and it was all based on customer service. So we had people walking in off the street that maybe had never been in education, and they were going in classrooms with students with really significant emotional and behavioral needs. So we needed to do something to change that. We also use asynchronous learning, which is kind of a really fancy way of saying we can do it anytime, any place. And we also use coaching, is what we're going to talk about in a little bit. So like Lindsay said, training in itself is not enough. We need that coaching piece, but we also needed a place to start. So our new employee training, the hallmarks of it is that we used a tiered approach. We incorporate some choice. We utilize experts within the building, and we try and incorporate school environment in the application, which includes full days of shadowing for our staff. So what this looks like is when the employees come to us, we rate them novice through expert, and they would do this with their program administrator. They would sit down and we would look at this based on the years of experience they have in schools, things like their, I'm getting tripped up. I have an issue with saying and someone told me that they were going to tally my ums today, so every time I say it, I'm going to pause. So I apologize for that. So within this, it's college experience, how much time they have in schools, if they have experience with students with disabilities. A good example of this is we're going to show you, if I could get some positive reinforcement for not saying that would be really amazing. We're going to show you one of our employees that she came to us from the Goddard School, which is a preschool, and we put her in a classroom of the naughtiest emotional support middle schoolers, which you guys that are in the, they're tough. But she did amazing. She did so well. So you're going to see her based on the new employee training, how that went. So looking at our framework, what we try and do is our staff that comes to us that are novice, they've never been in the building before, we can do really structured, more formal training, so we can have people stand and deliver, essentially. But for our staff that comes to us that maybe they've been a teacher and they're retired and they want to be an instructional assistant, they need to do something that's completely informal, and we would set them up with like a computer-based module where they could learn more about instructional practices or something along those lines. So the more common the learning needs, the more formal the instruction, and the more unique learning needs, the less formal the instruction, and the more engaged in the workplace. So the types of training that we use is we did live training. So for things like learning how to use our point system, we would do live, because anyone that comes to us would need to learn that, regardless of whether they were a highly experienced teacher or not. Things that were computer-based, we'll talk a little bit about it. We used a system called Relias, where they could go on and look at all different behavior-based courses, things like that. We also worked on job embedded, so if we taught them how to use the point system, we would put them in the classroom and make sure that they knew how to grade the skill cards. And then the job shadowing would be, since we had two different distinct programs, we would include some time in the other program so that we had staff that was trained to work in both programs. And so really quickly, this is our one of our and if you guys have any questions, like the new training manual is like 60 pages. We have like a professional learning plan that we would go through. We have the different modules that we would use. We can share any of those resources, but to get you to lunch on time, we're gonna keep it short. So this is Katrina.
My name is Katrina. I'm an instructional assistant here at the Learning Center. Prior coming to the Learning Center, I worked for 8 years in early childhood education at the Goddard School, and prior to working there, I was a behavior specialist and mobile therapist. I believe the learning experience that I had through training was helpful. It allowed me to learn additional information about doing the behavior charts, putting the points into the system, and also learning how to establish rapport with the students that I'm working with. The greatest benefits for me was in training, I was able to meet new IAs, hear about their past experiences, establishing rapport with them, but also learning about the other staff that work here at the Learning Center, what their positions are and how they will help us within the classroom setting. I believe the most valuable component about the training series was just learning about the guidelines that are present here at the Learning Center, whether it be school-wide in the building and also within the classroom, and just knowing what the recommendations are and how to work with the students to understand where they're coming from, their background, and once again, just learning how to make that connection and learn more about them to make the day flow much better within the classroom. The training experiences that I've had at other jobs involved a lot of online training, more or less sitting at a computer, going through different modules. Here at the Learning Center, it was much nicer just because we had other staff members coming in, talking to us about the different things that we had to learn about the school. So here, it's been a much better experience for training as it's in person. You can talk to other new staff that are going through the training as well. So I preferred it much better than just sitting at a computer and doing online training.
So the logistics of what the new employee training looked like is that initially when we ran the first one, we set out 2 weeks, 10 days, and we had plenty of information to fill it, but what we found is that it was really difficult to find subs, all of those kinds of things. So where it has morphed and grown, what we do now at this point is, last year we offered the training 4 times a year. This year I think we're down to 3 because what's happening is the staff is not coming on board at consistent times. So we always run the training program in August. We do it for 5 days at this point. We typically do one January, February, and then we'll do one again in May. Things that they're doing at this time are things that we need them to know to be ready to work. So verbal de-escalation strategies. If they're a member of our crisis team, they would get training on physical interventions. They would get just basic understanding of how to work with students that have all different types of disabilities. And like I said, we can provide more information about the modules that we use, but just so you have that framework, it's a 5-day training program. And if they would start before we offer it, we would put a sub in place and then have them attend. The other thing that's been beneficial with this program is that if we find, being a supervisor, that there are people that have been with us for a long time that perhaps need a refresher, we will assign them to go to this 2-hour training to refresh how to do point sheets, or, and it's not all PBIS related, it would be formative assessments in the classroom, all of those kinds of things, to be able to be ready to work. So the implications for that has been that we have newly hired staff that's ready to work. So as a teacher in a classroom, you get an aid thrown at you, and all of a sudden you don't have the 12 faces in front of you, you also have the staff that you have to train while you're trying to do a million other things. So we feel like this has been an unofficial, less burnout for our teachers, because prior to this, our teachers were responsible for all of this. The highly trained staff is available within the classroom, so because we're training them before they're entering it, we're able to intervene and have classroom management and support within the classroom instead of having to refer out. And we also have staff that's trained to provide support across programs. So for our next reflection, we want you to take some time and just jot some ideas. You have 1 minute to think about what are some new employee training topics that you could apply to your school. What are some things that your staff needs to know right away before they set foot in the door? So just jot some ideas of topics that you might be able to use for a new employee training. Have about 10 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Harris. And finish with your last thought, and then we're going to move on. So the next type of professional learning that we want to talk about is asynchronous learning. So again, focusing on the challenges that we had, high staff turnover and consistency across programs. If I have one new employee starting and I can't assign them to new employee training because it's not happening for 2 or 3 months, what do I do with that person? Obviously, when they're coming into a building that has such a high need for structure, all of my staff starting needs to know what our school expectations are. They need to know about our lesson plans. They need to know how are they going to redirect the students when they see behaviors of concern. What are the consequences? We need consistency. So with asynchronous learning, we can plan for when it's convenient for the employee or the supervisor. If I can't stand and deliver what my school-wide expectations are, how am I going to get that information to my new employee? A live moderator is not needed for this type of learning, and it can be administered one at a time with our new employees, but they could also do it over the course of a time. So as a supervisor, when I have a new employee starting, I might not be able to get them a sub for an entire day, but I might be able to put them on a module for a half an hour at a time or an hour at a time. So we can do that. And the other benefit to this is that portions can be repeated as needed by the trainee. They may not be inclined to raise their hand and ask questions in front of an entire group of staff, but they might be able to go back and learn it. The other aspect of this is that they're always going to have access to it a month later, 2 months later, things like that. So this is just an example of the training progression that we use. This is what we use for our PBIS model. So the first module is the overview. The second model is how to utilize a skill card, corrective consequences, problem solving, and then we would review everything at the end. Initially, so this is an example of just the guided notes that we use. The important piece of this, and I forgot to mention with new employee training as well, just like when you're teaching students, there has to be a goal, there has to be an end in mind. We utilize competencies for all of our training. So with new employee training and also with asynchronous learning is that there's some kind of competency built in. I clicked too fast. But they would be able to use the guided notes. So this is an example when we did our refresh in January was right before we did our set. So these would be remind yourself what the school-wide expectations are. You taught these expectations using lesson plans when. So this is something that the staff can refer to keep fresh. And this is not a plug for Relias. This just happens to be a program that we have found the benefit to using this. So it started out as everything in PowerPoints. We only have the first module in Relias at this point, but what it gives you the opportunity to do is basically take a PowerPoint, slide it into the system, and you can control how fast they go, they can't click through, and you also build in the competencies with it. So if you want them to get 80% before they pass, that's all part of the system. The additional thing that we like about this is you buy it per seat. So if I have high staff turnover and someone leaves, I can take their name out and slide someone else in. So it's not a plug. I'm sure there are a lot of other computer modules out there. This just happens to be one that we found that works well for this purpose. So just quickly, another reflection. You have 1 minute to think about what are some topics that your staff needs to know walking into your building? Is there something you could use asynchronous learning for, like your school-wide expectations, something like that that your staff has to know before they set foot in a classroom? Write down just a list of topics.
Okay, about 15 more seconds, and then we'll have you wrap it up, and we'll keep moving, because we want to make sure we get through everything and also leave time for questions. So 10 more seconds now. Okay, we're going to keep rolling along. I know we're going a little fast, but next we're going to move into coaching. So Kristen already gave you an overview of the new employee training, the asynchronous learning, and now we want to talk about that follow-up piece, that coaching. So again, this is the quote, staff training is necessary for assisting human services personnel in doing their job, but rarely is it alone. So training is good, but it's not quite enough. And so what we have here, this is sort of the way that we at Devereaux like to support our schools in thinking about their training or their coaching models. So we approach coaching from an organizational behavior management model. And this graphic is sort of a summary of a meta-analysis that looked at over 200 studies on in-service trainings. And this is what typically happens. So typically we have a training and we explain the theory. So we explain why the strategy works. We have a discussion about implementing that strategy, we model the strategy, we show what it looks like to do the strategy, and then we have staff actually practice the strategy in the training. Sounds pretty typical, right? But what the research shows over and over and over again is that's not enough. So we do the training, and then there's really no impact on the classroom after that training. So the staff leave, we're like, great, go do it. And maybe they do it for a day, but then it's gone. So what the research shows is that we need to add that coaching component, and we'll talk about what that looks like. But we need to add feedback. So we have observations, we have feedback, and then that's in the actual classroom. Then we actually see the outcomes on teachers implementing the practices and students having more positive outcomes as a result of that. So there's really two ways to approach training. Train and hope is what we usually do. So that's just what I described. We provide a training. We do a great training, right? We do modeling, we do practice opportunities. It's a good training, but we don't follow it up with anything. We just hope that teachers will go back and they'll do the things we train them on. What we advocate for is training and coaching. So we add that coaching piece, and we're going to dramatically impact the transfer of the skill from the training into the classroom. And so again, when we talk about coaching, we're talking about a repeated cycle of observations and feedback, and oftentimes we'll set some goals for how are the staff, like what is going to be mastery? How do we know the staff is doing what they're supposed to do? We set some sort of goal. So performance feedback. This is sort of our organizational behavior management model for how we look at it. So the first step is to set some expectations for the staff and provide the training. So what do we expect you to do? And here is how you're going to do it. After we do the training, we implement some antecedent strategies, so some things before they actually do the skill that's going to help them to remember to do it. We observe the skill in the classroom, and then we apply consequence procedures. So what do I mean by antecedents and consequences? Antecedent procedures help the staff to actually perform the skill. So they're things like trainings, increasing structure, providing models, having them rehearse, or providing prompting. It could even be as simple as email prompting. So maybe you email all your teachers, remember last week we did a training on praise, we really want to increase our praise ratios. That would be an antecedent strategy. A lot of times we just rely on the training. Consequence procedures are those things that happen after that observation that are going to help maintain that skill over time. So most of the time this is performance feedback, and that's what we really emphasize. Most of the time when we work with schools, we use written feedback, graphic or visual feedback, and verbal feedback, but you can also use publicly posted feedback, or you can incorporate some sort of reinforcement procedures for your staff. So if all of your staff are implementing this skill really well, you can have some sort of like staff celebration or staff party. You can incorporate that as well as a consequence procedure. Now, when we were kind of thinking about how we wanted to approach coaching, obviously we want to approach it from an organizational behavior management perspective, but there's tons of research out there about coaching across many different disciplines. So obviously athletics, the business world, and of course education where we are. So this is just a model of like how some of those different components can come together. That slide was poorly placed, but back to performance feedback. So performance feedback, again, we're just targeting a behavior. So we're setting expectations for staff. This is what we're looking for. We go and observe it, and then we provide feedback on that thing. And research shows this is effective across settings. So whether you're in general education or special education, it's effective across student age groups. So if you're working with elementary teachers, middle school teachers, high school teachers, if you're working with teachers or aides or maybe a counselor or a school psychologist, performance feedback works for them as well. Again, you can provide it through visual means, written means, verbal means, and you can use it across any number of skills. There's tons of research to show that this is effective for improving treatment integrity in schools, so how well staff are implementing interventions and strategies. I'm not going to get into it, but there is a lot of research out there. But the three sort of takeaway points for improving outcomes for students with emotional and behavioral disorders is one, that you have to have good training. So you need training that focuses on effective, evidence-based procedures. The second thing is that you need good training procedures. So not just the training itself. We don't just want to train and hope, but we actually want to train and coach. So you need good training, you need coaching. And then the third thing is that you want to apply evidence-based practices to your coaching as well. So you don't just want to go in with any old coaching strategy. You want to provide antecedent supports, so reminders, prompts, but you also want to provide consequence strategies, so performance feedback and reinforcement. So you need those key three ingredients to have a good training model within your school. And Matt is going to tell us more about coaching at the Learning Center.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression. I mean, hope is certainly a virtue that is to be revered and respected. But what I'm going to share with you a little bit now is just our journey from the recognition that we needed to add that coaching element and that lens, and sort of how it's evolved the past couple years. So we initially piloted a coaching process just between the department heads, and I believe there were 4 of them at the time in the building, who would then become the coaches, the classroom coaches. And we utilized feedback from that work with them. And one of the big outcomes was that we worked with the Human Resources Department to shift the supplemental position of a department head to that of a classroom coach. So it forced us to enumerate, this is what we want classroom coaches to be able to do, and a lot of that tied into what Lindsay just shared with you. So to summarize that, we were defining what coaching is, and then as we rolled into the subsequent school year, we determined that we were going to focus on coaching lesson agenda, skill cards, and transitions. So 3 things that all very closely tied into our school-wide PBIS implementation with the launching of Tier 1. And through this work, the coaching team scaled up their implementation by focusing on the programs within the building that showed the greatest level of need based on student referrals. We didn't want to overreach. We wanted to map out a project that was doable for the first year and ensure some success. But most importantly, we wanted to make sure that we were being very strategic with our coaching so that we were still very closely tied to observational data that we could very explicitly and deeply discuss, not just as a coaching team, but between the coaches and the teachers. So we were gathering true baseline data, at least 3 data points in each classroom before we made any decisions about how to move forward with them. We had skill trainings on each of those areas for the classroom staff being coached. We used classroom agreements as a follow-up to those trainings to make sure that there was a mindful plan in each room for the staff in there to ensure that those skills were implemented as we trained. And then we also made sure we were gathering survey feedback to check for effectiveness of the process for the classroom staff, but also the social validity of coaching. And it was really good that we did that because we teetered on the edge the beginning of the following school year as more of the coaches and then the coachees in the classroom got to develop a better understanding of what coaching is. They're like, hey, this isn't supposed to be so evaluative. It looks really scary when you're coming in and we're talking numbers and what are you doing with that data? And certainly having had some experience as a provisional school-wide facilitator in the past, that is clearly not our role as a coach. It was never our intention, but to help things continue to grow and grow that culture for coaching, we had to put some things in place and very clearly communicate that. So the following year, as we scaled up to coach all staff in the building, we first needed to establish with, okay, everybody's asking these questions. we now need a global understanding of what coaching is. So the coaching team wordsmithed and authored a coaching mission statement, and we also had to develop some norms for meeting and collaboration, because all of this boiled down to communication. So not one of us on the team could go rogue. One of our most important norms is that we always discuss and agree to what we're communicating before we put it out there, because it is a very delicate balance when you're asking people to be vulnerable and be open to receiving that type of support. And I apologize, I'm not usually a podium presenter. I just have a lot of information to deliver, and I'm really committed to trying to meet our goal of getting you out to lunch on time. So, some of the things we had to do to address the concerns about coaching was just making sure the administrators in the building were clear that we are committing to this being a non-evaluative process, okay? So we had to be willing to have that open forum and make sure we were putting that out. We work closely with our union reps. And we also coded, just for an extra layer of protection, we coded all of the data, okay? And I, sitting on the coaching team as an admin, did not have anything to do with inputting individual data. We would review as a group at the aggregate level, which is fine, but even though it was just teachers inputting it, our teacher on special assignment, we still coded it, okay? And we made sure every staff understood why and how that worked. And that, I mean, truly after that, everybody was happy. We dove right in. So in our meetings, we focused on not just the coaching process, but also the skills that the coaches needed. So we had to continue to grow the coaches. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how we differentiated support, because that was in order to get to all the staff, and we only had 5 coaches. We couldn't coach everybody at the same time. So we looked at level of need, and we also looked at readiness to move on. We developed some decision-making rules about, okay, you're at mastery, okay, you need a generic programmatic approach that we're going to package for you, or maybe we need to sit down and discuss some more individualized coaching intervention. And those were all things that were discussed both at the coaching meeting and the coaches separately. So, all right. Just another notable thing I think that was helpful to the coaches on that note of their professional learning was we had them develop individualized action plans for the year. And myself and the special educational instructional coach and the TAC from our IU, we selected The Art of Coaching by Ilana Aguilar as a text to sort of ground some text-based seminars for them after we looked at their individualized goals. And that's how we are this year and planning to continue next year, feeding them and meeting their needs. So we meet twice a month religiously in the morning at 7:30. We normally bring food. We do whatever we have to do to get people there. And we have monthly staff updates where we share out with the entire building. We're saying if this is a transparent, safe process, we want to back that up and say, okay, here's how we're doing as a building. And we're not specifying who's being coached, but in the aggregate, here's how we're doing around this skill. And that's led to some really meaningful follow-up conversations between staff and the coaches. In fact, it led to a request and a development of coaches piloting themselves, designing and implementing all of our trainings. I'm not doing them anymore. The coaches do them. They're holding their own workshops for staff on strategies they're requesting. And not a planned outcome, but one that has been very helpful and we're definitely going to continue to utilize. But within the classrooms, the coaches are providing their coachees at least weekly feedback. We did feel it was very important that the coachees got to select their coaches. So while we only had 5 in the building, we had 35 classrooms, we still wanted to give that choice and honor the relationship, okay? And whenever possible, we allowed them to continue with that same coach because as they invested time in building that relationship, we wanted to continue to have them benefit from it. So these are just some of the evidence-based strategies that we discussed and reviewed as far as inclusion. We did elect some of them this year. We focused on lesson agenda again, opportunities to respond, student task engagement we did across the board so we could have some correlational discussions, not necessarily causal, but if we're working on this, hey, what happens to be happening with student task engagement? And then praise and effective corrections. And I'm just going to give a shout out. Lindsay did an amazing job on this next slide. I feel so spoiled. I was like, here's kind of what I'm thinking. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's magic. So we started by conducting baseline observations this year. And within the Learning Center, all the programs that were there. Okay, and we looked at two specific classroom management skills, using lesson agenda and providing opportunities for students to respond. So as we completed them, we used those decision-making rules that I talked about earlier. So we had to determine which staff needed it and which ones needed it the most. And then individual coaching was indicated if the staff demonstrated less than 80% of the steps for lesson agenda or less than one opportunity to respond per minute. Now, we could only do up to 11 classrooms at a time, but we decided it would be better for them to be able to go deep into that process, not just for the coachees, but for the benefit of the coaches, because they were also learning the before, during, and after process as they were going. Is anybody familiar with that process? Opportunity to respond. Raise your hand. Yeah. Any PIC members here? Pennsylvania Institute for Instructional Coaching. All right. I know they do utilize the BDA process quite formally. So they continue to work through the coaching sessions weekly on the skill, and they were coached until they showed mastery. So not quite airless teaching, but along the same lines. We want to continue to provide support until we got them there. So we're avoiding that vertical line that Lindsay referenced earlier, the drive-by trainings versus the coaching plus, right? Because we wanted it to be evidenced, and evidenced on a consistent basis. So we also prioritized 6 classrooms for coaching support for opportunities to respond. We did not expect this right off the bat, but what we pleasantly found was, oh my gosh, there are a lot of classrooms that are doing a good job with this. And that was a really nice aha moment for the coaches. But then my aha moment was like, oh, now the coaches are like, oh, I need to get this person to talk to this person, or maybe I can go in so this person can go see that person's classroom and it's not just me saying it. So it's nice to see them have those realizations and take on that change agent role a little bit more and provide some more positive reinforcement for the classroom staff. Now, I do have to clarify, some of it is because certain classes are more preferential to students, or we have pre-vocational programs in the building with a lot of hands-on instruction. But regardless, there's all something that the teachers were going to be able to learn from each other. So as we prioritized the support there and continued weekly observations, we did the same thing. We continued to coach until they met the target goal. So here we have just the supportive embrace. I love this infographic, credit to Kristen, with the coaching team at the bottom, or classroom staff rather, and all of the support is enveloped around them. So we have the coaches providing that direct support, the coaching team, which includes the coaches, myself, Lindsay, and like I mentioned before, 2 internal sources of expertise for instructional coaching and training and consultation. And the steering committee. So I just wanted to note the steering committee is sort of the building-wide oversight. So it includes building level administration, central administration, and representatives from Devereux First Senator Effective Schools, as well as a few teacher reps throughout the programs. And one of the big benefits that has provided us is to make sure that our work is aligned, coherent, and effective at helping us meet our goals. And whereas all of this comes down to a form of collaboration, what we determined was that we had to specifically discuss these 3 areas in order to get coaching to be effective. We didn't always get it right. There were times where we stumbled or were like, no, mulligan. But the solutions really lied here. And it's easy to say, oh, well, we'll just collaborate a little bit better. But we had to break that down. Speaking of breaking down, this is some of the data. Just wanted to give you guys a visual and example of what the coaches were actually discussing in our meetings together. So like I said before, we have the success with demonstrating the lesson agenda skill. But those dots on there are the student task engagement. Okay, and so those dots, we made sure we represented on whatever skill we were coaching. We were continuing to track student engagement, not for mastery criteria, but just so we could dig a little bit deeper to see. I mean, ultimately, we're coaching for what? We're not just coaching for staff behavior, it's about student outcomes. So that was very helpful. And here we have an example of our opportunities to respond. So you will see, even though the trend is positive for demonstrating opportunities to respond, because it's an aggregate, there was obviously variability on the individual classroom level. But you will note that the student task engagement did decline. We were able to tease out that this was during a lot of the weather-related events, delays. So what happens when our students miss some of their routine? Yeah, okay. Don't want to overwhelm you, I know. It makes me anxious too. So, due to some of that and just some other things happening in the building, we felt comfortable knowing why. Okay, so it's just like when we're doing progress monitoring. If we don't know why, that's a dangerous situation to be in. But we did feel we were able to discuss why that was happening and that it was not a direct result of improper implementation of the skill or the coaching. But it did lead to some meaningful conversations that the coaches could have in follow-up meetings with their coachees about how to keep routines consistent. And because you're all probably so tired of hearing me talking, we have some feedback from our coachees and coaches.
My definition of coaching is to really pair and kind of be a student as well as a coach. When you're coaching, you're learning along the way, and I think you need to be honest about the things that you don't know, as well as the things that you share that you do really feel you have mastery in. So for me, it's a journey that you do together with someone. You may have expertise in one area, but they generally have expertise in another area. So it's really, for me, two teachers who are working along the same journey, and you're just kind of being the leader in the scaffolding of how you're doing it.
So coaching has worked very well with PBIS at the Learning Center in that the whole idea of a PBIS system is to enable the students to better access their education. When you have the coaching piece added, what you're doing is you're ensuring that that education is even more meaningful for the students. So I can't have a PBIS system that brings the kids in the classroom and has them working hard for things if I don't also provide them with really quality teaching that's constantly growing in its craft as well. So it allows the teachers and the PBIS system or the behavior staff to work together to provide a meaningful education to the students.
Coaching has affected my practice by implementing multiple resources of technology. Also with the lesson agenda, it's really helped me stay on task as a teacher. The feedback that was most impactful would probably be how to engage our students in this population, how to get them excited about learning when they're in an environment that doesn't always boost the morale for them.
What I love most about coaching is that it allows me to go into other people's classrooms and learn different styles of teaching that are going on elsewhere. I know that I'm the coach, I'm coming in, I'm supposed to be giving advice on how to increase student outcomes, but I really feel like I'm the one actually learning because I get to see the different teaching styles that other people are using in their classrooms.
What surprised me most about coaching was that other people might not be as open to it as I was. I guess I kind of expected that it was going to be this great, we'll come in, we'll all work together. And that happened with a few of my peers, but there were quite a few people when approached that were very tentative, they were concerned.
I have to be honest, at first I wasn't on board with coaching and the coaching model. Now I feel that it helps everyone in some capacity. There are certain aspects that might not be as helpful to one teacher that is helpful to another teacher. And I feel it's necessary to have that kind of coaching model so that teachers do feel supported by administration and also by coaches that can serve as a mentor, someone who can just bounce ideas off of each other and, really help strengthen your craft as a teacher.
I was really excited. The opportunity to get coached, to me, there's no way I could do everything perfect right off the bat. And I kind of consider myself a lifetime learner in things. And, the opportunity when it presented itself, when I first started, they wanted to, and I was more than happy to say, yeah, come into my classroom. Tell me how I can make something better. Let's make this as great an experience as it can be for these students.
So one of the MasterCard moments I experienced while coaching was actually just recently. I went into a classroom to observe the praise to correction ratio. And as I was there, no joke, one of the students raised his hand and said, I love all the praise I'm getting this morning. And he had no idea that that's what we were working on. So that kind of just goes to show you that the students do notice, either consciously or subconsciously, when there is a change in the classroom, and a positive change at that.
For those of you who are wondering what a MasterCard moment is, does anybody remember the commercials? Some things are priceless. For everything else, there's MasterCard. So when I was asking coaches to reflect before we did some of these takes, I said, what's your MasterCard moment for coaching? So I don't know. I like to think about it that way. So thank you for hanging with us. We're going to shift a little bit and try to tie all of this together now. So you do have a handout in front of you. It looks similar to this. We wanted to show you sort of an exemplar of how we utilize this template. So as all of you are familiar with any type of school-wide PBIS, it is matrixy heavy, right? It's all about the matrix, the almighty matrix. Yes, we love our matrices. So we were like, oh, well, mainly Kristen, was like, why don't we apply this theory to professional learning? And what it has done is it's helped us to really define, align, and refine on an ongoing basis not just our professional learning plan, but when it's in this type of format, we can start discussing how we tier it and how we individualize it based on the staff's need. And again, not just on the front end upon entry, but on that ongoing basis. It also leads to a lot of conversation around planning and communication, and it ties very nicely too with core team work around when you get your BOQs done. Are we doing this with fidelity? And for areas where we need to work on, how can we do that with more fidelity? Because at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the OBM model of how are we changing staff behavior, right? And it's not just providing the support, it's providing that support in a timely manner and really finding that Goldilocks spot. Because at the end of the day, when you're working with the population that we have in our school building, we need people to be happy. We need them to continue to feel good about what they're doing. Nobody comes to work to hear some of the things we hear, but to reach out to those children and to make sure that they are having the positive experiences that we're planning for them. So to honor our earlier agreement that we want to allow you to take this with you and do that. Is everybody okay with that? Say yes. Yes. So please do take some time. Slides 21 and 22 will be super helpful to you. Okay? Sort of those continuums that Kristen referenced earlier. And this is just in summary, in tiering the professional learning, we've been able to address a lot of these challenges and struggles. And our next steps include continuing to grow the capacity of the coaches, balancing strategic professional learning with more of that traditional autonomous instructional coaching model, and maintaining a healthy culture for coaching, and continuing to work and refine those processes that we've established and shared with you today. So just wanted to note there were 6 or 7 opportunities to respond in this session, and I'm going to let Kristen. We've also given out 48 Panther Bucks, right? Do I? Okay, 11. Who has 11? Anybody have 11? Come on down. These black and yellow, not for Batman, by the way, even though I love him. Black and yellow arrangements were made by our horticulture students. And if you scan the QR code, the young man who made them will actually appear on your phone and you'll get to meet him. 14. Who has 14? All right. Lindsay, your favorite number? 43. No, wait. Did we give that many out? 43, in the back. So please, please, please reach out to us with any questions. We would love to hear from you. Feedback, questions, thoughts.
Does anyone have any questions?
Does anybody have any questions on their reflection sheet or otherwise that you'd like to ask us? What's a BOQ? Benchmarks of quality. So as your core team and school works through school-wide PBIS implementation, you'll become very familiar with that. Other questions? We'll hang out, but first we need to allow Kristen from Patton to give you the code.